people are going to ask questions on this.
If you don't mind taking a seat, James. When the mayor comes down, you're more welcome to get up and both parties will meet.
It could be two. It could be like.
No, I mean, why do they stand? Can't they just ask questions?
Nah.
Oh, it's all digital. Where's it going to go?
Someone's going to have it, and then they're going to ask, and then they'll be like, yeah, and then be like, this is the question. What do you think? If it's like about young people, then they might pose it to you. But it'll just be stuff that you already know.
I haven't been there for long.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
It's crazy, isn't it?
They can make this like a fear. Different test.
Yeah. But they're going to demolish it.
Oh no. Oh wait, demolish it?
Apparently, that's what I've heard, yeah. Because there's no use for it.
And what are they going to put in? How?
It's more so focused on education, impact assessment,
Gross, isn't it?
That's gross.
because our panel
That's going to be like
is more
Yeah.
education, COVID.
Probably going to be like 10k a month.
More new, I haven't
Flat.
seen it.
It's just going to be the flats what are there.
But I think that's fine.
Imagine it was
Maybe
English
just look at
instead.
the report.
One of them was
But also on-street services, impact of COVID-19, this stuff that kind of what stuff
Are you just going to be
stuff like that along those lines. Our panel have an idea about stuff like that. But yeah, exactly. Any other questions?
who's going to sit down?
Like, what do you mean by that? Oh, of a panel?
No, because you didn't go to the dinner.
To the mayor?
Not saying this is
He'll
for
be
me.
doing the meeting, he'll be doing an opening address, so not too much.
Let me just.
Look, it says you're underneath assembly.
Okay, that's fine. But it's more like questions like, what policy do you have in place for developing schools after COVID, stuff like that. Like what you would ask to the mayor at home or anything. So yeah, don't worry about it too much. Once you start going off these discussions, you'll get a feel for it. So yeah.
They're going to be asking questions, basically. And if you want questions, you can ask the mayor. Do you know the
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I'm sure you have. Right. Well, I didn't think she's not yet.
Speak to her briefly.
Alright, cool then. That's
I don't want to sit right there, bloody, right now, or right in front like I'm some boss.
you just say
Hi, Georgie.
Hi, how are you going?
How are
I'm
you?
Georgie.
Kulvarn.
Okay. So lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome.
We are thrilled that you could come at such short notice as well.
No, it's an important event.
Oh,
I've been involved with our local in Redbridge,
oh, great.
and I attended an event now,
Ah.
and
very unwise for him to risk that.
Very unwise. I mean, all these young people come ask questions.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I've seen it on Zoom things before. That I've seen it. I think it was youth services, like the mentoring one.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's one I've been to. They're very good. So, yeah. You know, kudos to you guys. Like this is my first year, and then I happen to also chair as well. So that's my first year done all in one. Yeah. So, I can't believe it's actually happening. Spent so much time reading email, but it's actually happening now.
Sorry? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so these are the OI members, and then gallery first, but that's all the OI members should be coming soon, like Katie said, it's a delay. But some questions have been there for a while, some are new, so yeah, I've just tried to like tell them, keep the questions relevant for all of them to answer, because I know there might be questions where you have low expertise in, but yeah, try to make all of your answers, yeah. Thank you. As I was writing the questions for the slide, I was like, what to put? Will these questions get the responses from people? It's nice to hear from people in education.
Absolutely. Spot on. The issues it raises. I'm quite liking it actually. And the walkovers, I know they all it probably says not event or something. Still moving in. Keeping an eye on my video.
Follow you later. Further east. Oh, God, one's quite far.
Where's the thing? It says what your school's called. But no information about you.
One's at Highlands.
Highlands is
Yeah,
what it was.
which is near Ilford and Uphall Primary School.
Sorry, it's my TPs.
She's at 5 Primary School. And then we've got 4 roles now. Schools. So we've got a system. Well, the same with and then the families of Woodford
Mind is dead. Lovely. Okay, big smiles, get those nostrils. Good. Okay, pop them back on now.
Thank you. One sec, everyone. We'll go again. Super.
Great. Thank you. Cheers. Welcome. Most welcome. Go to the gallery as well. Sure. Great.
Okay. I'm sorry, but could everyone start taking their seats? I know there's a lot of excitement, but if we start moving into taking our seats, please. Yeah, if you could just move with the photos, and if everyone starts taking their seats, thank you. So I'm sorry, everyone, for the delay. As you can see, there've been protests, so City Hall and security has been much more delayed, but thank you all for coming. And I think everyone's starting to take their seats now. Thank you. Okay. So, I would like to give a very warm welcome to all those attending today's event, the Young Londoners Question Time, whether it be here at City Hall or if you're joining us virtually. I am Samaya Bangora, Chair of the London Youth Assembly, and today I will be Chair of this panel. But before we dive into discussion and introducing our panelists, we are honoured to have the Mayor of London here today to give an opening address.
passionate about the future of young Londoners and the opportunities on offer to them with initiatives such as the London curriculum and a new deal for young people, I would like to hand over to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sian, not only for that kind introduction, but for everything you do for the London Youth Assembly. It's great to be with you all here today at City Hall in person. And a big hello, because I understand people are watching online as well, so hello for those watching online. Look, I'm sure this Young Londoners Question Time is going to be a fantastic event with a much higher level of debate than the BBC Question Time version, I'm sure. It's usually me who sits over there and answers the questions when I'm in this chamber, but it feels great to let others step in today. The London Youth Assembly has put together an impressive panel from across the political spectrum behind me. They'll be introduced properly shortly, but I want to say how great it is to have the Member of Parliament, Kate Green, with us. She's the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Kate was Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group and has been a leading figure in the Labour Party since 2010. It's also great to be joined by the Chair of the London Assembly, Andrew Boff, and the Assembly member, Sian, who's the acting leader of the Green Party. Although both Andrew and Sian represent other political parties, I've been proud to work with them on issues where we have common ground, such as protecting the planet and fixing the housing crisis. And we should always remember that, yes, of course, you can have political opponents, but your political opponents are not your enemies, and often they can be allies. And it's not just politicians with us here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Javaun and Kulvarn, two experts with a lot to say about youth work, education, and much, much more. Let's please have a round of applause for our panellists this afternoon. Look, the pandemic has been difficult for everyone, but I know that young people in particular have been hit hard over the past year and a half, missing out on school and college during the lockdowns, suffering job losses, and not being able to see family and friends as much as you'd like during such an important period in your lives. I know what a strain it's been on young people's well-being, mental health, and education. And that's why the excellent report that has been produced is so important, setting out your concerns clearly, so we as politicians know what we need to do to tackle them. I've always been passionate about helping young Londoners, working to ensure that everyone in our city has a shot at making the most of their talents. London gave me the opportunities I needed to go from a council estate in South London to becoming mayor of the greatest city on the planet. Ultimately, I believe that every young Londoner, regardless of their race, gender, faith, disability, class, sexual orientation, or background, should have the same chances to succeed. And that's why my overarching mission for London is to ensure that all Londoners get the opportunities that our city gave to me and my family. It's the idea that there should be a helping hand to lead you along the path to fulfilling your potential, something that is needed now more than ever. I call it the London promise. The promise that if you work hard and you get that helping hand along the way, you can achieve anything. As part of this, we're working to create thousands of high-quality jobs for young Londoners, targeted at those who need them the most. We're helping young Londoners gain the skills they need to succeed in the growing industries that will be key to London's recovery. And we're ensuring that every young Londoner is entitled to a personal mentor and can access good youth facilities. I'm determined to make sure that our recovery includes everyone, particularly young Londoners. We certainly still face some difficult times ahead. There's no getting around that. But by working together, I believe we can deliver a better and brighter future for young Londoners after this pandemic than before. And that we can make London a greener, safer, fairer, and more prosperous city where no one is left behind. Thank you all so much for coming to City Hall today. I'm sure you're going to have a fantastic afternoon. Thank you.
Today. We are so grateful for all the support that the Mayor offers to the work of the London Youth Assembly. It's a shame you couldn't stay with us to sit on our panel today, but we look forward to hearing his response to our report titled The Impacts of COVID-19 on Education and Opportunities for Young People. So, I would like to welcome everyone to the Young Londoners Question Time. Before we get started, please could I ask that everyone check their electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. In the event of an emergency, please follow the directions of GLA officers as how to evacuate the building. To ensure the safety of everyone at today's event, we are requesting that attendees keep their masks on. OIA members may remove their masks when asking a question of the panel. Panelists may remove their masks when seated. If you are watching online or sitting in the viewing gallery, please submit your questions via the online platform. Details for how to do this are in the description notes on YouTube and on the handouts you received when signing in. So, this event, I would say, is initiated by the London Youth Assembly to create a space for young people to air their concerns and questions to important politicians and figures in London. The past 2 years have been a difficult time for humanity, and especially young people. This event hopes to serve as part of the healing process for young people who are searching for accountability as well as answers to their questions. We just want to say, well done to every young person in this room who persisted through those tough times. Subsequently, this year, the LYA's priorities were the impact of COVID-19 and lockdowns on education and opportunities for young people in London, including those from disadvantaged groups, and mental health and well-being with a focus on the impact of COVID-19. We had some important discussions on mental health and spoke about potential future initiatives like mental health first aid. However, it was education that we really focused on this year. On the 13th of July, we launched the London Youth Assembly survey on education. We had over 1,000 responses from young people ranging from year 7 all the way through to year 13, from every single London borough except one. The findings of this survey allowed us to put together a report titled The Impact of COVID-19 on Education and Opportunities in London, with 11 recommendations for the Mayor and other local authorities. This report can be found on our online webpage, and it is a tangible piece of work composed of the thoughts of young Londoners put together by young Londoners. Now, the event will work like this. We will start with the introduction of our panel, then questions from our LYA members, guests in the viewing gallery, and the online audience. So without further ado, let us begin the Young Londoners Question Time. So obviously, we will start with the introduction of our panel. And each panel will have the opportunity to introduce themselves formally, telling us a bit more detail about themselves and their role within politics, education, or both. As one of the main focuses of our event is on education within the capital, I thought it also be fitting that the panelists answer this question as part of your introduction too. What is one thing you would have changed about education when you were in school? So I hope everyone got that question down and ready to answer. So a reminder that those submitting questions online are audience members sitting in the public gallery, so everyone up there and those who are joining us online via our live stream. Our YA members are asked to raise their hands when they want to ask a question, and I will call on you one by one. So the first panel member I would like to introduce is Andrew Boff, Chair of the London Assembly. Andrew has been a keen supporter of the London Youth Assembly for a very long time, and I am thrilled to welcome him to another London Youth Assembly event. So, Andrew, could you tell us more about the work you do, who you are, and what is one thing you would have changed about education when you were younger? Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Samia, and I'm really delighted to be here and to see so many people here, bearing in mind that there is a pandemic on, and so it's really encouraging that there is the interest amongst young people to get engaged and to participate in the democracy that we have around us. So I'm Andrew Boff, I'm a member of the London Assembly. The London Assembly is a body of 25 members who are elected at the same time as the Mayor in order to hold the Mayor to account. And we do that via questions such as this. We have statutory powers to summons the Mayor to answer questions. And it's something that you're going to have a taste of soon when we get to the point of being able to have, we're trying to get somebody from the Youth Assembly to come along and sit with us at a Mayor's question time and ask the kind of questions you want to ask and have the same privileges that an elected member of the London Assembly has. So this is an exciting time for democracy in London. I've been on the Assembly now since 2008, and I've been involved in politics since I was probably younger than most of the people around here, to be honest. Trouble is, over the years, politics has got a dirty name. Most politicians merely want to improve the world that they see around them. They want to make it better for other people. They see problems that they want fixed. And the way to do that is to get politically engaged. Like yourselves, I used to attend youth clubs. I set up a youth club. I've run youth facilities in Hackney a few years back in an area where there was considerable gang activity. And it's pointed to me that what it's indicated to me through those experiences is that unless young people are involved at an early age in those matters that affect them, we are going to create people who feel that democracy is not their friend. If we can't pull people in to those debates, help them participate in the things that go on around them, pretty much democracy will lose its fan base. And democracy is what we should all be enthusiastic about. This year, I was selected by the members of the London Assembly to chair the Assembly. Annoyingly for me, that means occasionally I have to be impartial, and that's the bit I hate most of all, as Sian will attest. I've got opinions and I like to voice them, and in this year I'm not really allowed to do that, but I've got a day off today, so I'm here apologetically as a Conservative representative to give our view of the world. When the Assembly is together and united and there is consensus, it is an extremely powerful body. And that's what we should always be working for. We will always have disagreements. I disagree with Sian and no doubt Kate with many, many things. But when you can build common ground, when you can build consensus on certain issues, it's a powerful thing. And so our politics should be about trying to get agreement, not trying to create division. And you're in a city with a lot of opinions. As many of you who came here today, you'll see the demonstration outside of people who are particularly concerned about, for example, the environment, as all politicians that I know about are. They may express themselves in one way, we may express ourselves in another way, but what's undoubtedly true is that we have the same values with regard to protecting the environment for the future and ensuring that climate change is minimised. So that's me. What's one of the things I would have changed about education when I was at school? I had a school uniform. I would have changed that at the time, to be honest, but they're all the rage now, so that hasn't changed. I think one of the things I would have wanted to concentrate on is that education, when I was brought up, wasn't considered a lifelong experience. And I think there's this barrier that people hit once they leave formal education, secondary school, that educational experience is not as easy to engage with after school. So that's the thing I would change. Just make it easier and more attractive to go into vocational courses, to go into something that's going to keep you engaged throughout your life. No matter how old we are, we've all got something to learn. I've got loads myself to learn, so I can't think anybody else is any different. So enjoy your debates today, and I really hope that we can come out of this better people than we walked into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And I know that learning throughout life is something you're very passionate about. And the next panelist I would like to introduce, and I'm very excited to introduce, is Kate Green, Shadow Secretary of State for Education of the United Kingdom. That's a very complicated, long title. But Kate has worked with young people in various ways for several years, and we are incredibly lucky to be able to ask her questions today. Welcome, Kate, and would you be able to tell us a bit more about your experience and work, and but like the question Andrew answered before, what is one thing you would have changed about education when you were younger? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samaya. It's really great to be here with the London Youth Assembly and at the question time this afternoon. I'm Kate Green, as Samaya said. I'm Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Education. That means I'm the main opposition spokesperson in Parliament on education. I'm also a Member of Parliament for a constituency in Manchester, so it's very nice of you to welcome me here to London today. In fact, I think a lot of the experiences that young people have in London are similar to the young people that my constituents and neighbours in Manchester would have, both big, diverse, exciting, thriving cities, but with some really tough things going on too. But I actually have a long association with London and with young people in London. And before I was in Parliament, I was very honoured for some time to be a member of the London Child Poverty Commission, and for a short time its chair. So I've got a long-standing interest in the issues that young people in this city face, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. It's been a really weird, difficult 17, 18 months for every single one of us, and I know that you as young people have suffered as much disruption to your education, to your life journeys as has anyone. But I really want to pay tribute to your resilience and to what you've achieved during this pandemic. Your commitment to your learning, your determination, your aspirations for your future absolutely speak to your strength and your capacity in the most challenging of times. And I'm very excited by the potential of young people here in London, right across this country, and very, very keen to make sure that in politics we are supporting you in achieving your aspirations and your ambitions for the future. And as the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, it's very important that when I'm thinking about the education policies that enable you to do that, that I'm listening to what you say. And that's why I really, really welcome this excellent report, Sumaya, from the London Youth Assembly. A few weeks ago, I published Labour's post-COVID recovery plan for education, and I was really delighted to see how many of the themes that are picked up in this report we've picked up in our report too. The emphasis on mental health and well-being, so important as part of the learning experience. The emphasis on the quality of teaching and how it matters that we invest in our teachers' professional skills and ability to support young people on their learning journey and make the most of their potential. And I'd also say, and this was something that the Mayor touched on, really important that we think about transition points in your life journey from primary to secondary school, from secondary school onto college or university or into employment. And that's something that I think, echoing what Andrew says, it's so important that we go on thinking about all the way through our lives, because young people like you starting out your working lives today are still going to be working probably in the 2070s. And I think we can be pretty sure that jobs are going to look a bit different by then from what they look like now. So it's going to be absolutely essential that we can keep going back into learning and getting new skills and adapting for the future. And I'm very, very excited by the capacity that I see among young Londoners for that change. This is a London event, and I do want to say just a little bit about what I think is really special about London, but also some of the greatest challenges. It's one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's also where we see some of the deepest poverty. And poverty really damages young people's learning and life chances. And so a big priority for me is how do we address and reduce that poverty among London's young people and their families. It's a city of immense diversity, but it's really shocking to read in your report that still young people are experiencing discrimination in the education system. Diversity is something we should be celebrating. It's one of the immense strengths of a city like London, and something that I'm very keen to hear more from you about this afternoon. And it's also, and this is the last thing I'll say, Sumaya, because you asked, what's the one thing I would have changed when I was at school? It's a city, like all cities, where it can be quite tough to be a young person, where you can feel at times isolated, lonely, unsupported, where perhaps you're suffering from bullying and abuse. And that's intolerable. And it's still going on today for too many young people. And it was going on when I was at school, 45 years ago. And if there's one thing I would have changed then, and still want to change today, it is an end to bullying in every part of our education system, and enabling everyone to know that they can speak out and speak up, that action will be taken, and that bullying, harassment, discrimination and abuse will not be tolerated in any part of this city, in any part of our country. And I know from reading your report that you feel as strongly about that as I do, and therefore that you, thankfully, will be leading the way.
Thank you so much, Kate. And is there applause? Thank you very much. And I think that's a very good point about bullying. It's sad to know that it's been happening throughout all of our lives and our parents' lives and our grandparents' lives. It's definitely something that needs to come to an end. So our next guest is Javaun Bance, peer outreach worker. And we are so pleased to welcome Javaun here today to hear about his amazing experience working with young people in underrepresented communities and his work with the GLA. Javaun, can you speak more about this work, about who you are, and one thing you would have changed about school when you were younger? Thank you.
Yeah, so hello everyone. Can everyone hear me good, yeah? So my name's Javaun, and I've been working on a peer outreach team for about 4 years now. And it's been an amazing experience, I must say, and it's had a big impact on my life and the way I view this city. First and foremost, to answer your question, I feel like one of the most important aspects of school I feel like needs to be changed is the support that's given to young people. And when I say that, I mean there needs to be extra money funded to schools to provide extra support for the young people that need it within schools. When I say this, I mean stuff like mentoring and counselling is something common within schools that's offered occasionally to young people that are going through certain experiences, etc. But it's not something that's provided on a consistent basis or on a basis where a young person may feel comfortable accepting it and not feel they may be bullied by their peers, etc. for accepting it.
Okay, thank you. That is something that the peer outreach team are working on at the moment, having mentoring on a London-wide scale. And the mayor did mention this briefly, so thank you, Javaun. And now I would like to introduce Sian Berry. Sian is also a London Assembly member and a very keen supporter of the London Youth Assembly too, and youth services. And it's wonderful to welcome Sian here today. So Sian, could you tell us more about the work you do, who you are, and the same question that every other panelist has answered so far? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a genuine honour to be asked. I was delighted to be asked to come. My name's Sian. I'm a Green Party London Assembly member, which means I sit in a group of 3 members now, alongside Andrew and the other parties as well. And on the London Assembly, there's no party that has an overall majority on the Assembly, which means that when we want to do things like pass reports that ask the Mayor to do certain things, or pass motions, and we've got 10 motions coming to our 12 motions coming to the next meeting, which Andrew needs to chair, which is a lot. But it means that no one party can just dictate to the rest of the Assembly what goes on, because we have a system of proportional representation, which means that the votes you get in the election are represented in the Assembly. And I think that makes for a better kind of politics, one in which, as Andrew has pointed out, people are seeking ways in which they can agree, because it's the only way we'll get things done. And I think that's the way things really are in life as well. So I was asked to come here, I don't think because both my parents were teachers and my sister is a teaching assistant, because I know very little about what goes on in schools these days. My parents are retired and me and my sister have different things to talk about. But I think I've been asked to come here today because of 2 things. One is my work on youth services in the London Assembly, which I've done since I was elected in 2016. This is the report I put out a few weeks ago, which is the 5th report that I've done since I was elected. And I've been looking at youth services since 2016 because young people came to me in 2015, 2016, just in the run-up to the election in which I got put on the London Assembly, and said, we've noticed that our youth centres are being closed down, that our councils are cutting back on our youth services under pressure of austerity, and we want the new London Assembly, the new Mayor, to do something about this. And so I found out that nobody was adding these up, and I've been doing that ever since. And it is, I think, a good example of where listening to young people is important, where the members of the London Assembly are there to listen and learn about what's needed. I've learned an awful lot about the value of youth work as a third type of adult that every young person needs access to, on top of parents and family and teachers. It's really important that people do have access to youth workers, and I've spoken with youth workers from around London and learned an awful lot that way. But also, by doing that work, by putting numbers on the cuts, and we've lost nearly half the money out of London's youth services in that time, I've also helped persuade the current Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who mentioned this in his introductory talk, to start putting some money back in, which wasn't strictly his job. You know, it's councils who are supposed to do this, but councils have had so much money taken away. When we had some spare money from business rates in London, the Mayor put some of that into youth services and created the Young Londoners Fund. And I just think it's a really, really good example of, again, finding ways that we can agree cross-party within London to get things done. So hopefully I'll get to talk about that a little bit more, because there's some more findings in my work, I think. The other reason I think I was asked is because in the recent election I put forward ideas for the London Youth Assembly to have a whole load of new powers, and that's because I genuinely believe that decisions are best made by people as close as possible to the people who are being affected by the policies. And I think the findings in the report that's just come out, the survey that says young people don't feel like they're being asked what to do next with services. They don't feel like they have input. It really speaks to me. When I speak to young people around London, I hear that from them all the time. And so, yes, I'd really like the London Youth Assembly to have more powers. I can go into exactly how I would like to do that, because now that it was one of my proposals in the election, but now I'm elected as an Assembly member, it's my job to try and persuade the rest of the Assembly members and the current Mayor to take these ideas up. So hopefully we can talk about that a bit more later as well. One thing I would have changed about education when I was at school, unsurprisingly, I'd like for there to have been slightly more democracy and less of the teachers just telling us what to do, more of a say for the young people within the school. And I'd also have liked to have had proper PSHE and proper sex and relationships education in my school. I grew up and went to school during Section 28, and there was basically nothing, and I think that left us not in a good, resilient place when it came to finding our way in the world of sex and relationships. It was a really, really bad thing.
Thank you, Sian. And as you can tell, we've got someone with all this knowledge on youth services. So I encourage you to have questions in regards to youth services as well. And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Kulvarn Atwal, head teacher of Highlands Primary School and Uphall Primary School. Kulvarn has worked in education for numerous years, and I'm sure he will offer an invaluable insight into the education sector and working with young people. Kulvarn, so can you please tell us, I think you probably know the drill by now, but tell us a bit more about yourself, who you are, and the question every other panelist has answered so far too, please. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. First of all, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to listen to you and to tell you a little bit about my experiences and what I've done. And looking out at the panel, from the panel, out at the members, I went to primary school in East London, and I went to secondary school, and I'm passionate about education right across this country, but particularly London, because that's where my experiences are. I trained as a teacher at the University of East London. I did my master's at the University of East London. I did my doctorate at the University of East London. And I'm very proud to say that as head teacher of Highlands, I'm head teacher of the school that I attended as a child. And one of the things that came through from the report is about the diversity across the education sector, because often children can't be what they can't see. And right across the panel, we've talked about aspirations and raising aspirations. And in terms of my experiences, my doctoral research looked at all the factors that impact upon teacher engagement in professional learning in our schools. And quite rightly, in your report, you've highlighted that, and the research will tell you, the single most important factor that impacts upon the quality of your colleague and your peers' learning experiences in schools is quite simple, really. It's the quality of teaching. The second most important factor is leadership. If we put those two elements together, I think we're missing a trick in the education system in this country, because there's insufficient focus on the quality of your teachers' learning experiences and how they impact upon you. And we can create a much more dynamic learning environment which reflects the diversity that you're asking for and has a high quality understanding of teaching. And going back to Andrew's point, when he talks about lifelong learning, the research, and a lot of research coming out of America and across Europe, will demonstrate that teachers progress rapidly in their profession in their first and second years of teaching, and that progression tails off in their third year. So we are not creating environments in our schools which enable teachers to actually focus on the needs of their children. And that brings me back to what I would have changed. Quite simply, I would have changed the fact that our education system when I was a child was just not inclusive. I sat next to a child who couldn't read very well, and I sat next to him for the entire year, and he couldn't read very well when we started, and he couldn't read very well when we left. And we are much more inclusive now, but we have to be more inclusive. We have to be, the second thing I would change, quite simply, in every classroom, there's too much teacher talk and not enough children talk. And so our entire method of teaching in our schools is based on a dialogic teaching approach. When we don't have children trying to figure out the answer in the teacher's head, that we have teachers looking for what's in children's heads first. And that comes back to what Javaun was saying about a greater focus on the emotional factors that impact upon your engagement in learning. My master's study, actually, it's interestingly, I read the report, my master's dissertation argued that the most important subject in school is PSHE. Because if we aren't emotionally ready to learn, it isn't going to matter how many wives Henry VIII had, because that's not important. So the final thing for you guys to think about is we have an education system that is done to children and not with them, and we focus on measuring that which is easily measurable, what you can do in a timed test and how much knowledge you can recall. And there isn't enough emphasis on skills such as how to work in a team, how to think creatively, how to think critically, how to argue, how to reason, how to debate, and the opportunities for children to question what they are being taught. So the final point I'd say there is the curriculum is not diverse enough. It's not reflective of the wider world. It's a very narrow Eurocentric view. Having said that, schools can do a lot more with their curriculum. Can't just say blame Ofsted and blame the national curriculum. There's a lot more work that can be done to enable children to be citizens of the world and not just citizens of this country. So I agree with what Sadiq was saying. I've been to many cities. London is my favourite city because there's a vibrancy and there's an energy here. And I think our education system needs to reflect that in such a way that empowers not just you guys sitting here, but everyone that is in your school to feel that they have a voice, to feel that they are able to engage and they can make a difference. So I think there's a lot of good work that you do and there's more work that can be done.
Thank you so much. And I think there were many points in your introduction that many of us here will agree with. So as you can all see, we have an incredibly experienced panel, from assembly members to MPs to youth workers to head teachers. We've got everything in this panel. And they have a range of knowledge of various issues and different parts of London. So we will now open the event to the questions, and we will begin with questions from the floor, from the LYA members and everyone who's sitting in the public viewing gallery. Get your questions into Slido, and I will also read the questions from Slido out. So I'm going to take the first few questions. If you have a question, LYA members, please raise your hand. Okay. If we go to...
Can you hear me okay?
Dylan first?
Yeah, Dylan.
Dylan,
Yep.
okay, thank you.
I wanted to ask Sean Berry, I think one of the reasons youth centres have been cut first when it comes to council spending being reduced is because of the lack of engagement in recent years. I think in youth groups as well, the amount of people attending has gone down dramatically, at least in my area. So how do you think we can get people back into youth centres? Because it's not going to help just putting money in but no one's turning up. We need people to actually turn up for the money to be spent on.
Javaun? I think it was who was your question directed to?
Sean, yeah.
Okay.
Shall I just jump in? I mean, you have a really good point there. I mean, youth centres need to be able to develop their services, to develop the activities that are available, to make sure that, you know, when somebody turns up and is looking for some advice or to speak to a youth worker, there's actually a youth worker there on shift who's able to talk to them. I think the problem started right at the beginning of the cuts, or perhaps even before. And I think, you know, we need to keep funding them and keep funding them to improve as well as just sort of hang on in there. Far too many youth centres are just sort of hanging on and keeping going and using volunteers, and that isn't always going to result in the best services. But keeping those spaces open for me has been really, really important, so that the buildings aren't sold off, because starting again from scratch would be the worst possible thing. And I think one of the reasons that youth services were cut in preference to other council services, I'm afraid, is because councils don't feel like they need to listen to young people. They don't recognise their voices. They know that people under 18 don't get a vote, which isn't the case in Wales and Scotland. So they can ignore the services that are aimed at those people. And I think that's very, very wrong as well.
Javaun, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, just on top of that, I think it's a factor of when you are providing the funding to these youth services and communities, what are you actually doing with the money? You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of people that get the funding and provide workshops, etc., that don't really provide any progress for the young person, whether it's for their emotional well-being or maybe essentially a career pathway to kind of get them back on path. Education, further education. A lot of these services that are provided don't usually break off into these areas, you know what I mean? So those are the things we have to focus on, I feel, in terms of when young people leave education, making them want to pursue further education and something they enjoy, and if not that, knowing the multiple career pathways they can take.
Andrew?
I'm quite interested in what you said. You reckon the attendances are going down in the youth centres, and I don't know why, but I've got an opinion on this. What a lot of boroughs did when they were faced with saving money is they decided to centralise their youth facilities. So many of the very small neighbourhood youth clubs were shut down in favour of fewer, larger facilities, which may have been well supplied for. It might have had tech in and all the rest of it. But what we've seen happen in London is that we've seen those neighbourhood clubs just disappear. And the irony is those neighbourhood clubs were the ones that were easier and cheaper to maintain than most of the large facilities. And I mean, I know this happened in Hackney, it's happened in Barking and Dagenham as well. And it's actually meant that the clubs themselves have often been remote from the young people themselves. They may have to gotten a couple of buses in order to get there, rather than just walking to the end of the street in the church hall or wherever it is you've put the club. And one of the reasons is because youth services have been very risk averse when it comes to including the community in the running of those youth clubs. And many of those youth facilities just used to be run by volunteers with assistance from professional youth workers when it was required. And it's ironic because we forever go on about how it takes a village to raise a child. Well, in some of these places, we've told the village to not pay, not get involved, and we slam the door in their face. So I think there does need to be a rethink about how we're providing those youth facilities to make them more popular and better attended.
Thank you. And does any other panelist want to add to that? Okay.
Like Andrew says, it's a really interesting question, and I think there are a whole range of things we've got to think about, Dylan. First of all, exactly as Sian has been saying, there have been very, very significant funding cuts, and councils have not been obliged to provide youth services. There's not a statutory obligation on councils to provide youth services in the way that there is, for example, to provide social care for older or disabled adults. So when they were running out of money, obviously it was easier to cut things that they weren't legally obliged to provide. Secondly, quite a lot of the point Andrew makes about centralisation, I think, is a really good one, and you see it at every level, nationally as well. So when a few years ago the government, David Cameron's government, set up the National Citizen Service, that actually sucked in quite a lot of funding that previously had been dispersed to the Guides, the Scouts, the YMCA, other youth organisations. And I think it is a really interesting question about have we taken some of the provision too central and not kept it local enough, a really, really interesting point. Thirdly, I think there's something about who's deciding what goes on in the youth clubs? Where are the young people in the management and the governance? Are we actually properly designing that into the way that we offer youth services? Are young people part of the management boards? Are they part of the design team for what's on offer? And then the fourth thing I'd say is we've all talked about youth clubs and youth premises, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of what's called detached youth work. Youth workers going out to young people where you are, being on the streets, in the places that young people feel comfortable themselves. Expecting everyone to come onto our space isn't always going to be the most welcoming way of getting people involved. So I think there's something too about thinking about how we can have that team of youth workers who are out and about, really part of the community. I'm very interested in some of your thoughts about all of this too, Dylan, because clearly it's something where you've got more first-hand knowledge than I've got.
Okay, thank you. I think has your question been answered well?
Yes.
Thank you. But thank you, panelists, for answering that, because I think it's a very good point. How can youth services keep running if no one's interested? And you've all highlighted various issues in regards to that. So I'm going to take one more question from the floor. Okay, if I take a question from you.
Come up to the podium.
Oh, there's a microphone on your desk.
Yeah,
so if
but
you
I prefer to stand up because it
okay, that's fine.
Okay. Hello. So, Miss Green, you spoke very strongly about bullying, so I think this question should go out to you. So, as COVID's prevalence has gone higher, things have come out like mask and vaccination. So I was wondering if the term anti-vacciner, where people choose not to wear masks and choose not to get vaccinated, pushes bullying in schools and isolation from people who choose not to wear masks and not to get vaccinated.
May I ask your name? Sorry.
My name is Dreon.
Sorry?
Dreon.
How do you do? Nice to meet you. Great question, Dreon. I think this is a really difficult question. I think you're asking a whole lot of different layers of question there. First of all, about the whole argument for anti-vaxxers or people refusing to wear face masks, and whether that's something that we support or want to give everybody that choice. And I must say, I'm concerned that if we're all part of a community, we're all part of a society, we do have a bit of a sense of responsibility for one another and looking out for one another. And the point of wearing a face mask isn't that it protects me, it's that it protects the people I come into contact with. The point of having a vaccination is partly that it stops me getting more sick, but it also means that I'm less likely to need to go into hospital and contribute to the growing queues and waiting times that we've got for other sick people who need treatment for cancer, heart conditions, or other conditions that they may have been waiting a long time for. So I think we've got to really understand why people are refusing to wear face masks, or why they might be refusing vaccinations, and try and have a proper dialogue in which we understand the concerns that are leading them to that decision, and talk about the concerns that I might have about what that means for everybody in the community, including, for example, in the school community. But if they're making those choices, and that discussion's taken place, and it's been open and honest, and the school's been clear about its policies and expectations, and I know schools are doing really good work on this, then I wouldn't think it at all tolerable, at all acceptable in any circumstances for any student to be bullied. It might be that the school policy is that a student should be wearing a mask when they're in the school corridors, and I would say the school has every right to enforce that policy unless there's a clinical reason, for example, why that student shouldn't wear a mask. But for that student to be bullied for that decision, and for staff not to act on that bullying, is simply not acceptable. I'm sure I can see you guys nodding as a head teacher. It would be wrong for school leaders to overlook that. There's no place for bullying, no excuse for bullying in any circumstances. What we need is open and honest dialogue when we disagree with people, as in politics, as Andrew was saying, as in the way we run schools or colleges or any other place where people might have different views.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take this also to Kulvarn as well, as someone who has been in the teaching community. How has this issue of masks and the vaccine panned out within teaching?
Personally, I think that young people aren't given enough credit. They aren't given the credit they deserve. And bullying is not something that just happens amongst young children and young people. It's reflected in wider society. In terms of what school can do, you can't look at a culture of anti-bullying in terms of just one aspect, for example, the mask or not. You have to have a culture of anti-bullying, and it has to be led by example. So, for example, every school I work in is a UNICEF rights-respecting school, which means that every child has a right to an education. So the culture starts with as a child, what is my expectation when I come to school? I should have a sense of safety and a sense of belonging. And that's when you talk about zero tolerance towards any aspect of bullying. And I was having a conversation with my children. I didn't mention I'm also a governor of a secondary school. And we were talking about the type of, we were talking about Little Mix, and we were actually talking about how they sound different now that Jessie's not Little Mix. You can see the exciting conversations we have in the car. And it's because of the online bullying that she received that made her feel that she couldn't be a part of this. And so when we look at, we need to look at every school and every education sector and judge it according to the child that is either achieving the least or succeeding and thriving the least. And currently we have an education system which says at 16 you've got to have 25% or 33% of people not succeeding. So bullying has to be about a culture in which in every tiny aspect of how a child feels, whether it's about the discrimination against, we talked about this earlier, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, race, and I think schools do a terrific job in terms of anti-bullying. They don't always get the credit they deserve, but clearly more still needs to be done. And if we've got children telling us or telling you guys that they don't feel safe at school, they don't feel that they can say to schools that it gets brushed off, then myself as a head teacher, I'm only as successful as the child that is unhappy. And that's why we've got to have a approach which is whole school, whole curriculum, and is reflective of the diversity of thinking, the diversity of ideas. Because my final point in this is that the most powerful thing a person can have is their self-esteem and how they see themselves and how they feel that they can be themselves. And often young people feel that they have to aspire to be a certain way, look a certain way, talk a certain way, act a certain way to feel included. If a person has, we live in a democracy, so you have a right to decide. So my final point, I agree with Kate, no one should be bullied for that.
But if I may, do you think it's the bully's fault for bullying children for being vaccinated or having masks because of the fear that the media and even in schools they implant into children for wearing masks? So like they might feel afraid of someone who's not wearing a mask, kind of forcing them to bully that person to get them away from them.
Yeah, and I deliberately did not say that that somehow there should be a form of punishment towards the bully, because the whole purpose of being in school is to learn, and behaviour is learned in the same way maths is learned and English is learned, through the making of mistakes. So there should be a dialogue, and as young people you should be able to discuss the influence of the media, the messages in the media, because a lot of that is down to misinformation that is shared online. And I think we do need to look at the online...
and that brings us to a question actually from Slido, but I think we can open this up to the idea of blame. And someone's asked, lots of young people feel scapegoated by the government and media for the rise in COVID-19 cases after being made to go back prematurely before schools were safe. Does the panel think school kids are to blame, or should the government have done more to protect us and our teachers? So I think we can actually move this conversation about blame, but it seems to be the main theme, into the wider circumstance that young people are faced in, if that's okay. Okay, thank you. So
I'll just say something quickly about that. I think our young people have been absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. You know, particularly in terms of their discipline. Yeah, last year's year sevens. You know, they've not known anything other than a one-way system and wearing masks in class. And so, in terms of blame, I don't think children have been at all to blame, and I don't think that they've had the voice that they've needed. But I just wanted to put that out there, because I just think it should be acknowledged that they've been incredibly resilient.
Thank you for your question, and I will take this to any other panelist who wants to answer this question about blame. Should the government have done more to protect us and our teachers, or should it have been school kids?
Well, I'm sorry, Graham.
Dreon.
Graham, I'm sorry.
No, Dreon.
Dreon.
Dreon?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, it's the old ears. Sorry, Dreon. First of all, there's no you can't give people an excuse to bully. And if somebody bullies, it's actually their fault.
No, I'm not giving an excuse to bully.
I get that, but nobody is forced to be a bully. They decide to be a bully.
No, but
and
you can be influenced to be a bully.
Sorry, excuse me.
I beg your pardon.
Can you let Andrew finish, and then...
No, come back. So what were you going to say?
But like, you can be influenced to be a bully by other things.
Sorry, I think we're going a bit off topic now when it comes to bullying, because bullying is a whole nother
it is a whole
issue in itself.
Ultimately, there are a whole range of reasons why people bully, but ultimately the person who bullies is the one that bullies, and that should not be excusable, whatever the issue. And I'm really upset to hear about that there is bullying taking place on the basis of whether or not somebody wears a mask or is vaccinated. It's just not allowed. It cannot be tolerated, and there mustn't be a get out as to why you bullied, because otherwise there'll be more bullying, and we just don't need it. With regard to young people being scapegoated, I think, actually I don't know anybody reasonably who says that. What they do is the media will often pick on it and decide to write something, because they're paid to fill newspapers and websites, and so sometimes they come up with the most arrant garbage that you've ever read, because they just have to fill it out. The idea of children being scapegoated is ridiculous. Children are just doing what the government has recommended. As to whether or not the government has made mistakes, of course they have. This is a pandemic, and they were kind of learning on the job. And they're bound to have been, when we have a an autopsy on this, when we look back on this period of our history, we're going to identify an awful lot of errors, an awful lot of mistakes that have happened. And the reason we need to look back at that and identify those mistakes is that it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. So I'm convinced of that. But also, you talked about that. You know, I'm not a teacher, mm-hmm. but my husband's been a teacher for 30 years. And so what I do know, when he comes back, I have to spend at least half an hour for him to offload on his school day. I think there should be a support group for spouses of teachers, because I tell you, it's and what I have learned over the years of listening is that what's the most important thing about schools is to create an environment where education can take place. And that means to make them feel safe, to get rid of conflict, to ensure that there are minimum levels of behaviour, because school discipline is very important. It's very important because it creates that environment in which education can take place. And that is what we're expecting of our head teachers who have set the policy, and we're expecting of teachers to carry it out. But what we also mustn't do is offload too much blame on teachers. Mm-hmm. They're kind of blamed for all society's ills, when actually society's ills are down to society, not any particular group. Mm-hmm. So I'm disturbed at what you're saying about there being bullying about this issue, and it needs to be attended to.
So I think we can all agree on the panel that bullying, there's no way to justify someone bullying, and we can move on from this issue of bullying because there's so much work being done in it within schools, within government. And thank you for your question. And if I can ask you to take your seat now, thank you. I'll take one more question from the floor, and then we'll try and get some questions from Slido answered. So if I could go to James.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panellists for being here today, first of all. In our survey, it says, do you know where to go as a young person if you want to contribute your ideas, opinions, and thoughts on current issues? Over 60% of respondents said they didn't know. Obviously, you can't expect every young person to want to be engaged in politics, but I think it is important that everyone is able to have a place where if there's an issue, they can go and it can be voiced and listened to, which I think is a major problem in young people, that many of my peers feel they're not being listened to. And not everyone is going to want to go to a youth council or, for example, places like the London Youth Assembly. There needs to be a place where young people can go to. And I just want to know what you think can be done to get young people casually engaged in current affairs.
I bring this question to Javaun because I think we've kind of answered a question along those lines, but I think with someone with youth work experience, casual politics along those lines, if that's something you could answer maybe.
Yeah, most definitely. What was your name again, bro?
James.
Nice to meet you, James. That's a great question. I think the first thing to think about is one of the first reasons I believe that young people do not participate or engage with politics is because they don't really understand it, to be honest, and I don't think a lot of people do if you're not involved in it entirely, because there's so much different factors. I think one of the best ways to get people involved is back to education, like we say. I think we need to maybe further educate young people on politics and the effect it has on our city, in our daily lives and all our different areas of living. If we did do that, I think young people would be more aware of how important politics are to them as an individual and to their family, etc. So to further develop on that, I think if they was taught this regularly on a regular basis, a lot more people would be interested in pursuing politics from all different angles, whether that was from a space like in here, or whether that was another place because they feel like it needs more support due to the current affairs of politics.
Mm-hmm. Very true, and you don't actually learn politics as a subject until A-level, which is something that you can think about. And I'm now going to move on to another question because we've Yes?
Can I say something on
Something
that?
quick.
Just
I'll let
very
something
quickly.
very quick and then we'll move on.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in my report about youth services, I talk about the fact that the young people who came to me in 2016 are now, you know, well beyond needing youth services. They're in their 20s. And I think there is a sense in which, for the last 10 years or so, the only consultations and ways of getting people involved in decision making, particularly in local areas, has been, you know, questions of which cuts to make, and those are dismal consultations to be involved in. You know, which trees do you want to cut down, which community centres do you want to close, and not exciting things. I think now that we're starting to think about recovery, now that we're starting to think about things like Green New Deal type spending, you know, developing new jobs for the future, these are exactly the sorts of decisions that I want young people to be much more involved in, because like with the youth service cuts, you're the ones going to have to live with those in the future. So I really hope we can sort that out to get a better voice for young people in so many different decisions, from planning local areas to developing new jobs and businesses to more youth services. It's just the right time to make that switch, in my view.
And as one of our recommendations you might have read already is to make sure that there's almost like a way young people can get involved in politics without getting too involved in politics if they're not interested. So I'm going to move on to a question from Slido, and it's to Kate Green and to all the panelists. How will you stop discrimination and labelling from our teachers in our education systems? I'll go to Kate Green first.
There's so many forms of discrimination, and a lot of them are, of course, and you refer to this in your report, I think, unconscious. They're part of the societal experience that we all have and the assumptions that we make that are sort of baked into our everyday existence. And I think your recommendations about unconscious bias training for school staff are really interesting. Unconscious bias training is itself quite controversial. There are people who say that's not the right approach to addressing this kind of discrimination that students and others experience, that the issue is actually conscious bias, and that's what we should be focusing on. So I was very interested in that recommendation in your report, and I hope some of the discussions that we can have in the weeks and months to come can unpack some more of that. I was also very, very interested in what was being said a few moments ago about the schools, all the schools at Highlands involved in being rights-respecting schools. I'm a huge fan of this UNICEF programme. I've got rights-respecting schools in my own constituency. It sets a whole culture, a whole ethos for a school, which actually is about respecting one another's positions, ideas, identities, differences, and having and agreeing on common values and themes. And it's such, I think, such a powerful tool in the education system. I'd like to see all of our schools as rights-respecting schools. And I think that's a really proactive way of tackling discrimination. It's not waiting for it to happen and then saying, how do we put the problem right? It's actually bringing students and school staff together from the outset and saying, what's our shared agenda? What are our shared values here? How do we acknowledge and respect one another's rights? And I think that's a really, really powerful way for us to think about running our education system, and I'm very interested to hear your experience of it. Mine is also very, very positive. The third thing I'd just say is that particularly in relation to, and I think this was touched on earlier by one of you, I can't recall which now, about role models and you can't be what you can't see. Our education profession is not very diverse. I had a meeting with some black school leaders a few weeks ago, and they pointed to what very, very limited promotion opportunities black and ethnic minority teachers experienced, not because there were overt discriminatory barriers to their progress, but just a lack of pathways, a lack of expectations for them, and a lack of people that they could see ahead of them who'd made that journey so that they could see how it could be done. So I think there's not just thinking about what we're doing in the classroom and with students, we've got to think about what we're doing with the profession and diversifying the profession and school leadership too. And then I think the data are really important. Actually knowing what's happening, getting that data, about the different attainment, the different school experience, the different outcomes for different ethnic groups, for LGBTQ pupils, for girls or boys, for disabled students. We need to have that data, because if we don't know that different things are happening to different students, we're not going to be able to devise strategies that may be leaving some students behind. So I think that this is a really complex question, and there's not just do one thing and you've ticked the box and it's dealt with. It's actually about the whole practice in a school, and the way in which all the information is used to make sure that every single student is treated as an individual and given every support to achieve their full potential.
Thank you, Kate. And I have a feeling there'll be more questions on diversity coming through from Slido and LYA members. So if another one comes through, I'll direct that to Kulvarn next time so you can get a teacher perspective. So I'm going to take a question from the floor now from the LYA members. If I could go to Amracharge.
My question is directed towards the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Are you and your team pushing for some form of reform for the 2022 A-level, GCSE and other examinations/qualifications, given that there has been significant disruption to learning because of the pandemic? What policies or what strategies are you proposing to the Conservative government? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really big issue for students who took exams last year, for students who took exams this year, and for students who are due to take them next year, and actually beyond that, because the disruption to learning is now baked in for students who won't even take their A-levels till 23 or 24 because of the disruption they saw in their year 10 and 11 years. So we do need a strategy for next year and probably for a couple of more years after that to recognise that disruption. And we also need to make sure that the students who got their grades last year and this year are being treated fairly and given support to make the next stage in their learning or their career journeys. So if you think about the students who got their grades this summer, many now moving on to college or university, but will have missed many, many days in the classroom before they got those grades. And that's why I've been talking a lot to colleges and universities about what extra support can you put around those students to help them with study skills or to fill in some gaps in learning that they might normally have done in school but hadn't had the chance to, so that they're not disadvantaged as they move into the next stage of their studies. And I know colleges and universities are doing a lot of thinking about that. I hope exams can take place fairly next summer, because I think they're a really important part of the way that we assess student attainment. And there's no perfect system of assessing student attainment, but I do think putting all your eggs in one basket, only relying on one terminal exam, has been pretty cruelly exposed by the experience of last year and this year, when the terminal exam couldn't take place, and we had nothing else really to fall back on. This year, eventually, it was decided to fall back on teachers' grades, and teachers had some notice of that. Last year, we didn't even decide to fall back on those grades until after the results came out, and that's created some real sense of uneven experiences that different students have had, and different students have been treated differently. So I think it's really important, first of all, that the government comes out really, really quickly with a plan for summer 2022. I've given them till tomorrow, as it happens, to come out with that plan. No sign of it yet, but you might like to look tomorrow to see what I'm saying about what might need to happen. Because I think we have some ideas, and I think teachers have a lot of good ideas. They've talked about having more choice in the exams, so that if you haven't been able to study a bit of the curriculum, there would still be something you would know and have had the chance to study and be able to answer questions on. We've talked about being able to take revision aids into exams, or prompt sheets. I mean, actually, real life is a bit like that now. I mean, I don't remember very much. I'll look it up on Google usually. So should we be thinking about different kinds of examination aids? We might be wanting to think about a mix of exam assessments and ongoing assessments, project work or interim exams, and planning some of those throughout the year. So I think we need a comprehensive plan that says we hope exams will take place next summer, but we need to be gathering information on the way in this coming year in case they can't. And we've also got to have a look at what hasn't gone so well this year. I mean, I pay great tribute to students who got the results this summer, really great results in the most challenging of times. But there were some anomalies. Private school students did better. Students on free school meals, disabled students, the black and ethnic minority students, some ethnic groups did least well. We've got to understand why that happened. Was it unconscious bias? Was it something else that was going on? And try to iron out those inequities, because it's really important that everybody, students, teachers, employers, everybody has confidence in our assessment system, and that people know that it's been robust and fair to every student.
Thank you, Kate. And I think it's all about pushing hope towards young people. And maybe, Andrew, if you could tell us how you plan, as a London Assembly member and chair of a London Assembly, briefly, how you're going to push hope to young people in these times.
Specifically on exams?
On basically life and education.
Oh, right. Slightly broadened it now. I think just to add to what Kate said, there will be some arguments about how we deal with the exams next year. But one of the things we've got to bear in mind that we must not devalue the reputation of that qualification. So whilst you're tempted to perhaps reduce the amount that young people have to know or demonstrate in such an exam, we shouldn't do it to the point where actually that exam, that qualification, is considered less important than it used to be. The A-level is extremely important for people's future careers and for their educational futures as well. So anything we do, keep the value of the exam up, and if that requires individual assistance, help towards closing that gap. You're not going to close an entire year's gap of education, to be honest, but at least closing some of the gap. Then all those initiatives are going to be welcome. With regard to young people's opportunities in general, well, there is hope. We live in the most wonderful city on earth. We are one of the wealthiest cities on earth. There are opportunities everywhere, and we've just got to make sure that those opportunities of our city are fairly available to everyone, irrespective of their background. And London is a great place to live. It sometimes can be challenging, and sometimes you just want a holiday out in the country occasionally. I know what it's like, but London is a place of opportunity. So of all people in the United Kingdom, London young people have got good futures ahead of them. But to go back to the point that was raised, I think, by James earlier, that if you don't know how to negotiate the democracy that's around you, if you don't know how to make representations, it's going to be a problem. And that, as James said, so many young people didn't know where to go if they wanted to participate in their democracy. It's not just young people. It's actually everyone. If you walk out on the streets of London and ask a random 100 Londoners what the London Assembly does, and they'll say, the London what? We have a real problem in trying to get people to understand that they live in a democracy and how to access that democracy. But apart from that, we live in a great city, and as long as we're all fighting on the same side, there's nothing but opportunities for the future.
Thank you, Andrew. So there we have it. London is the city of hope and opportunity. So I'm going to now start directing questions just to one panel member so we can get through as many as possible. So to Sian, how can we create an accurate sex education curriculum for educating LGBTQ plus pupils, as well as boys, girls, and intersex people effectively in spite of consequences of Section 28?
Well, thankfully, Section 28 is no longer there. And I know that Caroline Lucas spent about 5 years, this is a Green Party MP, spent about 5 years trying to get through Parliament the idea that good PSHE, including sex and relationships education, should be compulsory in schools. And I think that has now gone through. But thank you very much. So the challenge is on for schools to really get this right now. And I think it's really important that it is done in as open a way as possible, in an entirely age-appropriate way. And this is something for teachers to solve, I think, is to get that right. And certainly my experience is not, like I said at the beginning, is not in education. But it is in looking at the impacts of attempts at knife crime education, as it were. So attempts at persuading people not to carry knives that are aimed at young people that I think are often very, very simplistic, i.e. police officers going into schools and showing pictures and sometimes even real knives to young people in the belief that this will deter them from carrying knives. And I think we get the same kinds of unintentional, well-meaning but wrong things can be done in sex and relationships education as well. The attempt to be euphemistic or not call a spade can cause people to not be educated as well as they should be. And I think I would err on the side of frankness in lots of cases. But getting things age appropriate is really important. And again, in youth education around violence, the Ben Kinsella Trust, based in Islington, have done fantastic work. You've probably taken your children there. Fantastic work creating an exhibition space which is suitable for primary school children, but properly educational about the consequences of violence. And it's just really, really, really helpful. And it features no scary images of knives, except in really carefully put together contexts. It's really, really good. So yeah, getting it right is important.
So I think it's taking the recipes for other things that have gone successful and implementing it in different ways for different topics, such as sexual education. I'm now going to take a question from the floor. Okay, I will go to Maya.
Hi, this one is aimed at Kulvarn. I think we covered it a bit, but according to the LYA survey, 27% of the people that answered it said they'd faced discrimination at their school. What can a school and a teacher do, or teachers do to stop this from happening in schools, and what have you implemented in your own schools?
Just before, and I kind of want to adapt that so we can get a really specific answer out of you. What has your school done when it's and stuff like that?
So when we were talking about a right-respecting journey, and the journey is the key word. You can't change culture in a month or a term. It has to happen through consistent practice over time. And in terms of discrimination comes from ignorance. And if as an education provider, you aren't looking at ways in which, firstly, the first thing in terms of what we do is we talk to parents about how they feel about being in the playground. We talk to children about the messages they're getting in terms of discrimination. So discrimination definitely in terms of race, right? Which when you really go into it, it's a project that we did, which was actually inviting parents from different communities to talk about their experiences of discrimination within the community. So discrimination against how people from Eastern Europe feel, discrimination about how Romanian Roma travellers feel, and that is about actually saying this isn't a school issue, this is a community issue. And being open to say, we need to change our practice. We need to look at things differently. We need to look at how we communicate, how we include different members of the community, so that we aren't just serving one group. So children aren't born to discriminate. They are a reflection of society. And one of the things that we do really well, I think, is actually have a curriculum that actually looks at discrimination and looks at the ways in which authors or books may be discriminatory, and we have the tough conversations, starting with us as adults, saying what are our views. This was last year, and it's some of the work around decolonising, diversifying the curriculum. It was very uncomfortable for some of our staff, and I'm not going to be necessarily going to what some people call white privilege or we're male privilege, but it is about asking the question. So the first thing I think we can do as an education system is actually really dig a bit deeper and say that none of us are perfect. We all have bias, conscious bias, because it's reflective of the kinds of, growing up in the 80s, you saw racism all around you. And I think that where we are in terms of LGBTQ+ is where we were on issues of race about 20 years ago. But if we've still got members of our English football team being discriminated against online, What message does that send to our young people? And I think what schools do badly is they ignore those tough conversations because they don't want to say the wrong thing, they don't want to get involved. And I think that's the most important thing as a school you should do, is to look within yourselves and ask those really tough questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kulvarn, for that answer. I'm going to take one more question from the floor. Yusuf?
Where do you want to see the education sector in 5 years' time?
Okay. I actually want to direct this question to you. As someone, you're the youngest in this panel, actually, so I want to know where you would like to see the education sector in 5 years' time, and seeing as you have worked with young people too.
Thank you. What's your name, bro?
My name is Yusuf.
Yusuf, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So yeah, first of all, obviously, there's so much different, obviously, things we can imagine we would change, but just because it's on my mind currently, based off what Kahan was just answering the question from, one thing I would change is definitely the education system itself, what young people are being taught, referring to in terms of decolonising it, and in every aspect, especially in terms of history. I think history is such a big factor for young people when they're growing up and being taught. If you're not being taught anything about your own history or what you feel is your own history growing up in school, how can you feel empowered or inspired in any way? There's going to be kind of constant tension within yourself in terms of being surrounded by a bunch of teachers in a school that maybe necessarily not grew up in the same community as you or not the same ethnically as you, and also on top of that being taught things that are not in any relevance to yourself as well. Another thing I'd add that could battle that as well is something I've thought about previously, is having culture days for young people in schools. So a day where a bunch of teachers, young people, etc. could bring in aspects of their culture, perform, create food, anything like that as such, and discuss with each other the aspects of their culture. I think this is a way to battle the ignorance that comes across when it comes to the teachers in the school, the different young people that haven't seen these different ways of living and eating, speaking, religion, etc. So for me, I think one of the biggest factors when it comes to school is just ignorance. Things need to be a lot more diverse and reach more broader in terms of education.
Okay, thank you, Javaun. And I'm going to read a question from Slido now. With the current climate change crisis going on, how will you ensure that education on the environment is made a part of the curriculum? I will go to either Sian or Kate, whoever feels best to answer this question. Sian, do you maybe want to answer this?
Shout out Natural History GCSE is something we've been fighting for, something where you can, I mean, at the moment, science covers a lot of the aspects of things like climate change, you know, the theory behind it, and geography will cover some of the aspects around sort of global changes in climate and weather and agriculture and all of that. But natural history, studying the ecology of the world around you, I think is something that more people should get to study. So we've been working with a number of sort of naturalists, including some of the famous ones, Chris Packham and people like that, to try and put together a curriculum for natural history GCSE, and it's been taken up, so it should be coming through.
Thank you. And so climate change is definitely something that's being introduced, that idea, into schools much more now. And I'm sure all of you have seen what your school has been doing in regards to this issue. So I'm going to take a question from the floor now. If I could go to, what's your name, please?
Casper.
Casper.
Is it alright if I take my mask off?
Yes, you can take your mask off.
Can you guys hear me properly?
Okay.
Okay, so my question is actually directed to the Shadow Secretary. Kate Green, leadership is sometimes defined as the ability to make decisive decisions with a restrictive environment. And it is fair to say that the government has given Labour councils a very restrictive budget. My issue is how Labour councils across the country are spending it and like kind of balancing the budget in terms of education and improving below average Ofsted rated schools. Because for example, in my borough, we have about 4 schools that are rated below average, and our borough is majority Labour controlled. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your plan, if in government, to improve these disadvantaged schools and students that are disadvantaged in these schools?
So
You're quite right to highlight the importance of funding, school funding. The funding formula for schools changed a couple of years ago. It now actually relatively benefits schools in richer areas of the country rather than in some of the more deprived areas. So I would say we need to look again at the national funding formula and the way it allocates funding down to local government and then out to schools. It's a problem if a poorer borough is getting less money for its schools while a richer borough is getting more as a result of the new funding formula. The second thing I'd say is, as I say, we published a recovery plan a couple of months ago. In that we've included some what we've called premium funding, which you would target very specifically at additional levels of need. So we already have the pupil premium, which is extra money for schools based on the number of students who are on free school meals and therefore defined as in low-income families. We've talked about boosting that pupil premium at certain points in the school journey. For example, as I was saying, at transition points, because that can be a very challenging time for children and for their teachers. Also for the early years, because that's a very, very crucial point in the education journey. What's going on even before you start school is really, really important. And so we've talked about boosting that premium funding in those early years. The third thing is, I think you're also right to point to the fact that disadvantaged students aren't just disadvantaged in school. Their home life, their lack of access to resources for home learning, whether they've got quiet space at home to study, whether they've got the digital resources. We really saw how when home learning became necessary during the pandemic, how children who didn't have those resources at home really struggled. So it's absolutely important that we make sure that family incomes are sufficient, that children can learn at home as well as in school, because I think blended learning is here to stay, actually, and we need to make sure that every child has all the resources they need to be able to participate fully in their learning in the classroom and at home. And then I think we've also got to make sure that investing in the teaching profession is also about ensuring that teachers who've got huge skill, experience and expertise are in the classrooms, in the schools with the most challenging, disadvantaged intakes. And that doesn't happen. It's probably less of an issue in London, although not an issue in London, than it is, for example, in some rural areas, some seaside towns, some remote communities where it's very, very difficult to attract and retain high-quality, experienced, trained teachers, and yet in some of those communities you see some of the greatest disadvantage and poverty because there are very, very few employment opportunities, for example, in seasonal seaside towns or in agricultural areas. And so it's really important that we design a way of attracting and retaining highly qualified, highly skilled teachers to be in those classrooms where schools and students are really struggling. And that's something I've been discussing with the teaching unions who represent the teaching profession about what would work to give teachers that incentive and make them want to be part of those schools and really help to turn those schools around. Because, as we've said several times today, the biggest difference you can make to a child's education is the quality of the teaching in the classroom. And that's where we've really got to make sure that we're directing our funding as well.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Casper, for your question. Now, I've got two questions, both from the Slido, okay. The first question will go to Kulvarn, which is why are parents not involved in the runnings of school now? And you can speak on that with your experience, whether that happens in your school or not. And the second question will go to Andrew, and it will be answered afterwards. And it is, how much difference do you think voting at 16 could make to the provision of all types of services for young people? So, Vosa, we'll start with your question, and then we'll move on to Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of parents, the influence of the home has a greater impact on a child's success in education than a school. So what can a school do if they want every child to achieve? They have to have strong partnerships with the home. And in terms of, I'm just going to, while I build on that, I'm just going to go back to just very briefly something that Casper's question. So we work in terms of have what we call structured conversations in which every class teacher has targeted children that may be at risk of underachieving. Those parents would have an additional 1 hour conversation, not 10 minutes parents' evening, 1 hour conversation every half term in which we go deeper into understanding the factors that may potentially impact upon these children. The other point that Kate made, which is really, really important, we invest more money in our schools in our early years than in any other year group. Because if you get it right at 4, and you get the behaviours for learning in place, and you get those children with the dispositions to have the self-confidence to achieve within a system that is very much ability-focused rather than effort-focused. So parental engagement means going out to parents' homes, not just expecting them to come into your institution and suddenly engage. And it's about making sure that that partnership is very much focused on where those children are and what they want to achieve. Casper's point is actually a systemic problem. We work within an education system that encourages competition and not collaboration. So there's no incentive for the outstanding school to support that requiring improvement school down the road. And I'll tell you from my own experience, when I went to Highlands, it was a requiring improvement school. It's now graded outstanding, and it's been the Mayor of London Schools for Success school 5 years in a row. The reason I'm at Uphall is because no one else would go there, and it is a requiring improvement school. But that's my personal choice. Now, children are leaving that school because of falling roles to go to the school down the road, which is graded outstanding. So what we can ask to look at a national level is how we can encourage more collaboration between schools, so those children that are benefiting from the best teaching and the best leaders have an incentive to share their practice beyond their own school, because the inspection regime in this country doesn't encourage that. And the final point about that, people are asking, because I've worked at 2 schools, both schools are graded outstanding, that your reputation is on the line by going into the most challenging school in the most disadvantaged ward, which is also requiring improvement. But that's because there's a moral obligation to do that, which is what you're suggesting. So it's not a simple, easy one to answer. The system has to support it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kulvarn. And now I'll go to Andrew with a question about if young people are allowed to vote at 16, do you think it would make a difference to the provisions of youth services?
Absolutely would. It's a marvellous idea, and they should have done it ages ago. I listened to the arguments against voting at 16, and they're all based upon young people haven't got the intellectual capacity or the experience to make those important decisions. Except no such test is applied to people who are over 18. We don't test them beforehand whether or not they're suitable to vote. Why the voting is important, it's about participation and whether or not you can participate in that democracy. Not every voter is going to vote the right way as far as I'm concerned, and not every voter is going to vote the right way as far as Kate or Sian are concerned. But they must have the ability to participate. And I absolutely believe that 16 would be a great step, and I know I'm out of step with many members of my own party on this, but their arguments just don't hold water. It's about being part of the democratic system, and we shouldn't exclude anyone.
I just point out that it's a vicious circle, that, because they don't listen, they don't speak to enough young people because they can't already vote.
Absolutely, you're quite right, and that's why it would be so much better, because, you know, if somebody, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, you're going to say you haven't, but I've knocked on doors before, and people, for elections and canvass, and people have said to me, oh, I'm not going to vote, I never vote, and then complain to me about the state of the street. And I just say to them very clearly, I'm sorry, if you don't want to participate, I'm really not interested in what you're saying, because it doesn't affect anything. You're not going to change things unless you vote. It's as simple as that. I know it's boring. I know it's, you know, it's sometimes difficult to do it, but you're not going to change things. And we've got to hear those voices. That's why I've pushed so hard for us to have just these special question times, which I hope are a great success. So that young people's voices are heard more in London, not less.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the floor now. Jasmine Jada.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Jada George. I'm a representative from Havering for the London Youth Assembly. Currently, young Londoners rated their school on an average of 5.97 out of 10, with 10 being the highest on how well their school is doing when it comes to celebrating and learning about other cultures, which is quite low considering how diverse London is. Many panellists have said this, that we have this amazing subject called PSHE, which I do agree on. PSHE is a great opportunity to make the school curriculum more diverse, as that is a space in the school curriculum to learn information to help us with our everyday life. For the curriculum to be more diverse is extremely important, as we would learn everyone and different cultures are different and unique, and we should celebrate that and learn about it. So, will you communicate with the PSHE Association to look at creating a more diverse curriculum? And I'll give my question to Kate, as you know, the Secretary of Education. Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree with you that it's actually pretty shocking that in a city as diverse as London, we're not seeing 10 out of 10 score for recognising, celebrating and embedding our diverse cultures in the education system. And I think it probably varies in different schools. I think PHSE, as we've heard many times this afternoon, is really, really important. I actually think that if we really want a diverse curriculum, we've got to look at everything that's going on in schools, not just what's going on in one class or one bit of the curriculum. Which authors are you studying in English or in French or in Spanish? Or is your school teaching Urdu or Punjabi? What languages, modern foreign languages, are available to students? Do they reflect the community that we live in? Which historians are you reading? Which different versions of history are you hearing? There isn't one version of history. There are many perspectives on history, depending on different people's lived experience of it and the way they recorded that lived experience at the time. Who's teaching you? Have we got a diverse teaching profession? Are they bringing a range of different backgrounds and experiences into the classroom? Which scientists are you learning about? Which mathematicians are you hearing about? Which musicians are you listening to? Which painters' work are you looking at? I want to see diversity in every part of the curriculum, not just in PHSE or in an hour a week when we teach about other cultures. I want, particularly in a city as diverse as London or Manchester, where I'm an MP, those cultures to be celebrated and recognised and discussed and shared right across the school experience. And I think that it's a great asset for our country that we've got so many, and for this city, that we've got so many different cultures and histories and ethnicities and faiths and belief systems to share and learn from. And I think it's one of the things that's going to make our country strong and successful in the future. And we should absolutely be making it the heart of the way that we run our education system.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Kate. We're just going to run over for the panel questions just a few minutes after 4 because we started a bit late and are all the panelists okay with that. But I'm going to take 2 more questions from the floor and then 1 from Slido, and then I'm going to ask the panelists for their final reflections. So if I can go to you, what's your name, please?
Hi, I'm
Aidan.
So in our findings, 55% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that the home environment had an impact on their education. I also believe that mental health plummeted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think one of the reasons for it was due to the lack of students talking with their friends and talking to teachers and therapists in person, because I think that when students or young people are faced with a problem, the first people they speak to are their friends or their teachers or therapists. So what I'd ask to Mr. Atwal is, what do you think that schools can do to equip young people with the abilities to help their friends, like in terms of talking to them properly? Because it's a bit of a burden to talk to your friends about issues that are quite touchy and hard, like drug use or abuse. So, and it's hard to do that. So what can schools do to help that be better?
Yeah. Or can I also add a question which is quite similar as well, so we can get both of these questions answered? It was also, how do you enable teachers and teaching staff to seek and help students who aren't comfortable seeking mental health help and counselling or therapy?
Right, so I'll go back to what Kate just said. It can't be an add-on. It can't be one person employed at the school who you can go to talk to if you need. That's about enabling a more specific support. So we have a counsellor, we choose to have a counsellor at one of our schools who does very specific activities with focused children. But I think the curriculum should be emotionally friendly in terms of mental health and well-being. Because the greatest single factor that impacts upon a child's engagement in learning is how they see themselves as a learner. So whether you're an adult or a child, how you are mentally ready to learn and emotionally ready to learn impacts upon your engagement in that learning experience. So that's the first thing. So going back to what Jada, was it? Jasmine Jada, what a name, lovely name. Jasmine Jada was talking about is actually start with, these are the skills that our children need to learn to be successful in English, in history, in geography. Then think, okay, what is the core, what we do is, what is the core text we want to teach that through? And then the consideration is that that text has to be supportive of a diverse curriculum. Then when you're teaching history, I think there's a fear somewhere that it's sometimes we're going to abandon a sense of understanding of British history, okay, by looking at other cultures. It's not as simple as that. It's by getting children to see experiences not just from the British perspective in the Second World War, but an actually more reflective narrative of the experiences of all different people that were involved in that war. So in terms of emotionally ready, I believe that the learning happens in a situated way, in a social way. So the dialogue between children in a classroom is as important, if not more important, than the dialogue, which is a traditional transmission mode of learning, where someone says they're the expert and comes forward. But actually, if the children are in an environment from the age of 4 up to 11, depending on the school, or from the age of 11, in which they know that they are able to talk. They know that their experiences from home or their fears are going to be just as important as whatever the learning objective the teacher puts out at the beginning. Then you create a culture in which the expectation in a rights respecting school is, if I'm a child and I've had this experience and I'm not ready to learn and I need to talk, then that investment has a far greater impact in their progress over time. Otherwise, that gap between the haves and the have-nots and the successful and the not successful just grows as they go through. And
I'm sorry, Kulvarn. Can you just wrap it up now, because we're nearing an end. But you're saying a really great answer. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm wrapping it up, and I think start from what your children need and your community need, and then design the curriculum around that. And I'm also not saying that there are limitations within the national curriculum, but schools can be more creative than perhaps they probably feel they can. I'll carry on.
I'm so sorry, but thank you, very insightful. So I'm going to take a question from Slido, then the floor, and then start bringing it to a close. And this one is for Kate. For young people in care continue to, be behind with their education. And briefly, could you tell us, for this person who asked this question on Slido, and for all the other maybe young people in care who need to hear this answer, what are your plans for young people in care?
Yeah, young people in care suffer some really appalling educational outcomes, way below what they're capable of. And some of it is about the disruption that they experience in being in care. Many, for example, moving through different placements, having a number of different social workers, often being moved out of the borough that was their family home, perhaps moved 2 or 3 or 4 or more times. All of that is extremely damaging to their learning. It disrupts their learning. Of course, it's very, very damaging to your well-being and sense of stability and security, which undermines your ability to learn as well. So addressing some of the deficiencies in the care system, never mind what schools then have to do to help children who are experiencing care, I think is absolutely fundamental. And there is a really important review being undertaken now for the government about children in care, led by somebody called Josh McAllister. And Josh is taking a lot of information and evidence from people, particularly care experienced people, in carrying out that review. And perhaps I could just, through you, Sumaya, ask if the London Youth Assembly and the young people you're in touch with, wanted to input to Josh's review. I think it would be really, really powerful for him to hear from young people in care in London or who've experienced care in London to give Josh some pointers on things that need to change. But for me, it is about stability, fewer out-of-borough, very few out-of-borough placements, fewer changes, dedicated social workers who get to know and work with the young person, and then that creates the basis for the way in which schools can provide support to those young people's learning. If we don't put those foundations in place for those young people, anything that schools try to do, they'll be doing with one hand tied behind their back.
Thank you, Kate. And yes, I agree that the London Youth Assembly would be happy to take part in what Josh is doing.
Yeah.
So, so now I need a question, but we'll not really touch on diversity because our panel have really gone into detail about it today, or we'll touch on youth services and how we engage young people because we've also touched base on that today too. So I need a question that is out of this world LYA members. So are you, I'm sorry if I haven't come to all of you today, but I'm going to go with Malkeet.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Atwal. So you said that your school is quite unique and you want to see teachers talk less and students more. I'm really grateful to be in a school which offers me that because my teachers really listen to us and we get our opinions heard. But what is it that your school does that is different to others, which could set an example for other schools within London to make sure that young people get their voices heard?
Yeah, well, the number one thing, which is my background, Malky, is not every teacher isn't going to come into the profession after 1 year of training to understand what we call dialogic teaching, which is about, for example, knowing when not to say anything. And as adults, as teachers, we feel we have to respond to every comment. And by not saying anything, Malky, you might then add more. Or your colleague might want to build on your ideas. And this hasn't come out of my head. Professor Robin Alexander talks about interthinking. So the biggest change I would make is there's in-school variation within the quality of teachers. Okay? Now, there's not enough opportunities for teachers to collaborate, to work with each other. The Chinese have been doing lesson study for 100 years. They're used to lots of teachers going in and observing each other, talking about their lessons, how to improve their lessons, reflective practice. So the biggest change I will make is I would enable every member of staff to see their teaching experience as a lifelong journey, that no teacher is an expert. And sometimes we think that because you have the subject knowledge, you can be a good teacher. I would look at how we can make sure that teachers have really strong professional learning opportunities to learn from each other, so the quality is raised right across the school, so regardless of which classroom you go in, which adult you work with, that everyone has that understanding of how to give that children's voice and how to enable them to get deeper into their thinking and to build their ideas.
Thank you, Kulvarn, and I hope, Malkeet, your question was answered. So we're going to move into the final reflections now, but before I move on, so the LWA has produced, this report without any funding whatsoever, which a lot of organisations actually can't do without funding. They need to fund the staff, pay them for their time, but the LYA has done this for free. So do the panellists believe that the LYA should be entitled to a budget? And more specifically, what we want to start off with this budget is a website. We don't even have a website to put this report on. So what do the panelists think? Just briefly about the fact that LYA has zero, and we've managed to create this report and get this event started, and then we'll do final reflections. So maybe if we go along the row, Andrew, just briefly.
Yeah, just submit I think I've said to you before, just submit the budget. And
okay.
Let's see what we can get out of the London Assembly. In the meantime, I'm looking around for officers, and I'm sure I can promise that we could make this this report accessible through the GLA website. I'm pretty sure we'll be able to do that, because it does need a bit of dissemination.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Kate, do you think we should have a budget or something to maybe, like a website at least?
I think what Andrew said is a really good start. Put in a bid. You've got a really good argument. Look at the work you were already producing. How could you develop and build on that? But I absolutely can't see any reason why, in the meantime, the Assembly can't host the report and other activities of the LYA, or perhaps give you a microsite within the site or something. But I think really important is that you work out what your plan and ambition is for the year ahead or the 3 years ahead. Work out why you need money and what you need the money for, and put that budget together so that there's a really good costed proposal that the Assembly can consider.
Javaun, do you think would benefit young people in better way?
Of course, most definitely. Put the bid in. The man, he's
And
saying
Sian?
Yeah, no, one of my proposals was that you should be funded to the extent that a London Assembly committee is funded. I mean, this report is the kind of stuff that we produce, and we do that with more resources than you've had. So yeah, you should absolutely have that. I would also like the London Youth Assembly to be able to put forward an amendment to the Mayor's budget, which is something that I'm going to be trying to push forwards as part of my work as a London Assembly member, try and get that done, because I think that would be great. I mean, the best education I've had as a politician is really going through the GLA budget and looking for money that's down the back of the sofa that hasn't been spent on things and proposing for it to be spent on things, and sometimes that works.
So thank you. And
just to note, in your budget, don't include a new Tesla, will you? That's probably not going to
Don't
wash.
get overexcited about how much an Assembly
I don't think
gets.
we'll get a Tesla. We'll just start with a website. And Kulvarn,
Yeah, I think what seems to be quite clear is there's a lack of opportunity for young people to have their voice heard and to engage. And I think this could be one of those moments where you strike while the iron's hot. You've produced a report without any support. Sometimes, and that's an excuse for people to think we don't need any support, and you manage to do a report. I would say take advantage, and I would share the findings of this report as widely as you possibly can, and submit the bid while you're in that position, to say that you can put yourself in a position to write more reports in the future and influence more people.
Thank you. So there we have it. You're all witnesses here today to them saying if we put a bid in, we should get some type of funding, fingers crossed. Okay, so for final reflections, we don't have time for speeches, but if you could sum up one actions young people could take from this event in one word or a phrase, what would you say? I'll start with Kulvarn.
I think in terms of the recommendations, I was nodding my head and relating to every one of them. So the one piece of advice I would give is don't just let the report slide. Just keep on asking the questions. Keep on asking what we're doing to diversify the curriculum. What are we doing to support less discrimination, bullying? Keep asking those questions, because we need to have that voice heard.
Thank you. And Sian?
Just very quickly, not one word, but two of the recommendations we haven't discussed is the promise that you've requested from Assembly and the Mayor to promote the London Youth Assembly more. So yes, we should definitely be doing that. But also, we haven't discussed housing at all, even though one of the findings in the survey was the effect the home environment has. So that the Assembly will be working on issues around overcrowding in housing and access to housing, particularly council housing, in the next few months. And I really hope you'll get involved with doing some survey work. If you can help try and involve more young people and more Londoners in that work, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Javaun?
Yeah, like Khan was saying, I think a lot of you covered great things and asked some amazing questions today. And I would just say, in your general day-to-day life, keep asking these questions and keep applying that pressure to anyone around you feel like isn't moving the way they should be.
Okay, thank you. And Kate?
Similarly, I think the report is great. You all represent the young people in your boroughs. Go and talk about the report to your local council. Take young people from your own local youth council with you. Talk to your councillors, talk to your MPs, tell them what it is that young people have said. And then Andrew's been saying this all afternoon, and I completely agree with him. It's so important that young people are part of the political system. If you're 16 or 17 already, register to vote. You can go on the electoral register as soon as you're 16. If you're 18 or over, please vote whenever there's an election, because politicians listen to the people who give us the vote.
Okay,
Thank you.
You've destroyed my one word, because my recommendation was just going to be vote.
Even better. More succinct.
But more vote, but also let people know that you intend to vote, that you intend to participate. Politicians won't pay any attention to you if you don't tell them you're going to vote and participate. So do that, because your voices need to be heard.
Thank you to all the panelist members. And I am so sorry if your question was not answered. If you're here today at City Hall, you might have the opportunity to ask one of the panel members your question during the refreshment break. And if you're joining us virtually online and your question wasn't answered, I'm sorry. I'm sure you can drop an email to one of them or find them somewhere online and ask your question. So this has been a wonderful event and an amazing way to close the 2020 to 2021 LYA year. I have had the honor of leading such a passionate collective of young people and chairing this fantastic conversation. I would like to thank all the speakers on the panel for giving us your time and answering the questions in such a thoughtful way. To all those watching online and who have stuck with us until the very end of the discussion, we see you, I can see you, and thank you for attending. And to all the LYA members, youth workers, and guests, I hope you gained positive insights from today's discussion. A thank you to all those externally who have supported the LYA, and thank you for all of your support this year, youth workers. And most importantly, LYA members, thank you for allowing me to be your chair, and thank you for all of your incredible hard work this year. I would also like to say a massive thank you to the GLA officers and the Assembly Secretariat, and especially to Georgie Abbott for the persistent hard work, effort, and support she gives to the LYA. Thank you, Georgie. So, there will now be some light refreshments in the Remembrance Gallery. We invite everyone in the viewing gallery, LYA members, and panelists to stay and enjoy. That's all from me. Thank you.
Brilliant, the chairs. Really brilliant, the chairs.